Hey, it's Hani Mourra from Simple Podcast Press, and you're listening to the 360 Entrepreneur with Jan Ilonga.
This is episode 203, and today we talk about becoming a better podcaster. Here we go.
Welcome to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast, the show for entrepreneurs and small business owners who dream big and want to do bigger. Join some of the world's top entrepreneurs, internet marketers, and best-selling authors as they share their inspiring stories, their struggles, and give actionable tips that will help you build, grow, and promote your online business. Here's your host, Yanni Lunga.
Hey, how's it going? Welcome to an episode that features somebody who's doing so much, and I mean so much, for the podcasting community. Today, you're going to get some advice on some of the things to think about, to focus on, and do to become a better podcaster. And you're also going to hear about a few tools you can use to improve your overall podcasting workflow and expand the reach of your podcast. The show notes page for today's episode can be found over at yanilunga.com/episode 203. All right, time to get started. Here's the interview with Hani Mourra from hanimourra.com. In today's episode, we go all the way to one of my favorite cities in the world, and that's because of who's joining us today. He's a Toronto-based softwarepreneur and dad, and he's the creator of the popular Simple Podcast Press player, as well as a series of content automation tools that include his newest project, Repurpose. He's always ready to share his expertise on podcasting, entrepreneurship, and SaaS, and he has done so on top-ranking shows like Entrepreneur on Fire and the $100 MBA Show, as well as at events like Podcast Movement and International Podcast Day. I'm so thrilled to welcome on the show a good friend of mine, Hani Mourra. Hani, how's it going?
Going awesome. Thank you, Jan. How are you?
Man, every time I hear your name or I see your face on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, I just can't stop thinking about how fun it was to meet you in person at Podcast Movement in Chicago. It's been quite some time now, a few months.
Yeah, I know. I'm getting withdrawals.
Yeah, it's been an incredible event, and I'm sure that as the conference continues to grow, it's going to get even better from many different points of view. Annie, I said you do so many things, and in particular, you're really helping the podcasting community. I mean, I said, when it comes to us podcasters, you are known for the Simple Podcast Press, so the podcast player that is really designed to help us get more listeners, grow our email list, and do other things. And I'm going to ask you about podcast players later on. And I'm also going to ask you about a new project you have coming up, which is really, really exciting. The first question I want to ask you, though, Hani, is if you could take a second to tell everybody a little bit more about yourself, because I know you, so for me I take it for granted, but if there is somebody here with you and I who doesn't know who Hani Mourra is, could you take a moment to share who you are and what you do?
For sure, yeah. Basically, I call myself a softwarepreneur. I don't know if I made that up or not, but basically software is my tool for helping content creators. So I help content creators who create podcasts, videos, live broadcasts, and help automate and distribute their content across channels, and also help them publish them to their website automatically. And the key here is the automation, but the second most important thing, probably the first most important thing, is you're growing your audience.
Right.
Tools that I'm creating are helping you grow your audience, get more listeners, get more intimate by growing your email list. So those are the purpose of my tools that I create.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And actually, you said it very well, because you help content creators altogether. I mean, I put the emphasis on podcasters, but as you well said, in your toolkit, the series of content automation tools you have created include also some that tailor to video, and you mentioned live video too, and then there is Repurpose, the new one. And you talked about the importance of obviously growing an audience and leveraging automation, so working smarter and saving time. And when it comes to podcasters, Hani, and this, I remember this is something you talked about when I first connected with you online at International Podcast Day a couple of years ago. You shared basically some of these things, so I thought it would be good to ask you about those here on the podcast. When it comes to the podcasting workflow, where do you think podcasters waste time, number one? And number two, if you have any advice or tip or tool they can use to get that time back and become more efficient?
I mean, it's going to vary between people, but overall, I think the focus of a podcast or any content, but let's talk podcast specific, is you want to create content that your listener wants to hear. Like, you want to create good content. That's the key. That's the heart of it. People get caught up with the editing, maybe trying to book a guest, and they're trying to get a specific guest because they think that guest is going to help them promote, and get more exposure, which may or may not be the case. It's focusing around the external things, about how to get things done, what tools, what audio editing do I outsource. There's a lot of questions, but really the heart of a podcast should start with, what is the topic that I'm talking about in my podcast and specifically my episode, and focus on delivering the best content. That's where you should start and focus on. But a lot of people focus on like the artwork and getting reviews, and all these are important. They're important pieces. Don't get me wrong. You need to do all these pieces, but you focus on coming up with a concept for your podcast if you're starting, or if you're creating episodes, focus on delivering, like over delivering in that podcast, because no matter how fancy your podcast is, how the artwork looks, the sound effects, the intro, but if the actual content is not interesting or not relevant, people are not going to stick around. They might listen to one or two, but they won't stick around for very long.
Yeah, I think you touched upon a very important point, Hani, because I think that's exactly what we want to do as content creators, whether we are podcasters, we create videos, we write blog posts. We want people to become long-term consumers of our content. So you said it, there are many different things that help move the podcasting wheel in this case, but we should focus on those that really make the difference, and it all starts with content. And when it comes to content, Hani, I think there is something, and we were talking about this in the Facebook group Podcast Growth Mastermind not so long ago, that I think when it comes to content, we tend to focus a lot on coming up with an idea, let's say a topic for an episode or things like that. Then we record it, we publish it, and that's it. We kind of forget about the content. But there are some things we could do to maximize the exposure of that content. And one of those is repurposing content. So I wanted to see if you have any tips, any strategies, anything that podcasters can do to repurpose the audio content they've created and really maximize let's call it, the juice they get from their content.
Yeah, for sure. You want to definitely, once you have the audio podcast, it's on your audio platform. The first thing you want to make sure you're doing is this, obviously being on the big directories, but podcast directories, obviously iTunes, now Google Play, primarily in the US. I wouldn't go overboard. Start with those two. Make sure you're best there. Make sure you have repurpose your episode on your website. I don't know if you want to call that a repurpose or not, but just make sure you want to have your content on your website, because a lot of people podcasting, we know, like you and I know, and people in the space know it, but if you talk to the average person on the street, they may not know how to listen to a podcast.
Right.
Somebody on your email list to tell them to go to iTunes, download the app, click here, subscribe is like a little overwhelming. I just want to listen to the content. Mm-hmm. So having it on your website for sure is must have. So you can send somebody a link, they can click play on your website and they can listen. And then from there, if they like the content, there'll be options. You'll give them opportunity to subscribe on the iTunes, Google Play, get on your email list. So having the content on your website gives you an opportunity to make them easy to consume, but also easy to get them subscribed on the different platforms as well. So yeah, definitely website is one. And then experimenting with other platforms, like taking your audios and putting them on SoundCloud to get discovered. I'm not saying this is going to work or going to get you a ton of traffic, but you won't know until you put your content on different channels. Mm-hmm. So something like SoundCloud, which, I treat SoundCloud almost like a YouTube for audio kind of thing. It's another discovery place. YouTube for sure, worth trying out, like converting your audios into videos and uploading them to YouTube. Those two are the key. And then as well, getting snippets of audio, either the whole audio or snippets, loaded them to Facebook and Twitter as well, if you have your audience there. You don't know until you put it in different destinations where people are listening. And the key to all this, no matter where you put it, you want to make it easy for people to click through back to your website, because that's where you want them to ultimately consume and most of your content, or get on your email list. Because if they listen to it on Facebook and then an ad comes up and they click on the ad, they're gone.
Right.
You want to invite them over to your website, let them stick around, and then hopefully we have enough good content on your site or good motivation for them to leave their email and connect with them further. So the goal of all this distribution is to get people back to your website.
Yeah, Hani, again, you're right on the money. And I mean, you started by mentioning the site, and you said it is kind of, we take it for granted sometimes, but as you well said, not everybody is familiar with podcasts, or if they are, they aren't familiar necessarily with how to get the app, find the podcast, subscribe, and all these kind of things. And this is important, especially if your target audience isn't people who are really comfortable with apps and things like that. So I think the advice you shared, Hani, is right on the money. And you said also, not only have our podcast on our site, but even when we're trying to promote it on different platforms, it can be SoundCloud, you mentioned, YouTube, it can be social media. We could use tools like Clamor or Wave to create audio snippets. You said we should always direct people toward our site, because that's the place where we can collect email addresses. And if your podcast is related to your business, then the site is probably the place also where you promote your products and services. So there is that component as well. And when it comes to putting a podcast on a website, Hani, I have to ask you to share some tips, or some of the things, maybe not tips necessarily, but some of the things the Simple Podcast Press Player does, because there are different ways a podcaster can add their podcast onto the site. And I actually wrote a blog post on this specific topic. And I said, yeah, there are many different players. So if you're using a media hosting like Libsyn or Blueberry or Spreaker, then they have their own native players. But you have your own player, the Simple Podcast Press Player, which allows podcasters to do the same things those players do and a lot more. So the first question related to the Simple Podcast Press Player, Hani, is could you tell people how the plugin allows them to put their audio content on their site?
Yeah, Simple Podcast Press is a WordPress plugin, so you have to have a WordPress site. People have asked if it works on other platforms. Unfortunately, not. So it is specific to WordPress. The unique thing about podcasters is people do podcasting in different ways, depending if you're using the Blueberry or Libsyn. But the good news is Simple Podcast Press works with both ways. But I'm going to speak about the most common way. So think of Simple Podcast Press as a automation tool and a player. So you set up the plugin, you put your podcast feed or your iTunes URL, and you say go. And if you wanted to, like you put this on the settings, you can have it pull in every episode. And what I mean by that is it'll make an episode page, a show notes page on your site, and add the player automatically. And every time you publish your site on Libsyn, Spreaker, whoever you're using for your hosting, it automatically shows up on your site. So that's the automation piece. Or you can add it to any existing page as well, player itself. So that's the automation piece. And the player, it's a nice player. We released 2.0 about half a year ago, which has been greatly received. And looking, it's very touch friendly, mobile friendly. Like you can scrub the audio with your finger if you're listening on mobile, like meaning you can scroll across back and forth. You can listen on double speed or 1.5 speed. So you can listen at different speeds. So this gives the experience, a good listening experience for a user, whether they're on your desktop or on their mobile device. But a lot of the big features of the player is the buttons. You can fully customize everything about them. And we have some default buttons that you can set them up to go to Google Play or iTunes. Leave a review. It's a very popular button. With one click, they go directly to a page where they can leave an iTunes review, which is kind of a complicated process. It can be a complicated process.
Right.
Simplifies that a lot. And you have 6 custom buttons. So if you have a product or a course or something you're offering for sale or for an opt-in, you can have people go to a page. So you can fully customize it. And even to the point where every episode can have a unique button. That's a new feature we added.
Mm-hmm.
So if this episode, you want to send people to a certain page, you can have a button for that. So buttons, email opt-in. You can turn on email opt-in, supports all autoresponders. And you can collect email addresses right where their eyes are, right? They click the button to listen and they hit play, and then just below that, there's an email opt-in box. So it's a good opportunity to collect email addresses. And then one of the coolest features is this timestamp feature.
Right.
Any time code you have, like 1:00, if you put those in your show notes, and they automatically, without you doing anything, they automatically become clickable. So you can give somebody a quick overview of the episode, and they can, just by clicking on the link on your page, the audio player will jump to that particular section, which is really handy because some people tune out in the beginning. If there's a lot of like the intro is maybe not very captivating, they don't know what they're missing. But if you give them 5 key takeaways with like time codes, say at the 1 minute mark we talk about this, they can click there. It will jump to the good stuff, and they'll stick around and keep listening. Otherwise, you might lose them in the beginning if there's a lot of intro, or maybe the topic may not seem relevant.
Right.
So definitely have those. That's a very popular feature of the Simple Podcast Press Player.
Man, thank you, Hani, for taking us behind the scenes or walking us through what the Simple Podcast Press Player does. And you said it does a couple of different things. So you said it's an automation tool that allows us to save some time. We can use it to showcase different things, leave a review, subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, whatever platform we may want to put emphasis on. And then you said there is the timestamp feature that I think is so powerful. And I have to admit, Hani, that I was guilty of not using that, even though I was using bullet points in my show notes page. But I think that having the Simple Podcast Press makes it so easy to enhance those bullet points so that they actually become not useful, more useful. Because as you said, with that feature, I can simply add a line of code with literally one click, just add the time the specific point is talked about. And then a person can click on it and go straight to that. So that even, as you said, even if there are certain things that may seem as if they aren't interesting to the listener, they may see one or a couple of bullet points that are like, this looks interesting. And if there isn't any way for them to go directly to those points, chances are that they may leave. Whereas if we make it super easy and they can go and listen to the specific strategy or advice or whatever the point is with a simple click, they can do that. And I'll make sure in the show notes, I'll make sure to link to everything, including your site, hanimourra.com, the site for the Simple Podcast Player. And I remember when you and I chatted for the Podcast Success Summit, we talked about podcasting, obviously, and you made a discount available for my people. So I'll link to that as well in the show notes. But if what Hani and I are talking about sounds interesting and you're looking for a player that is really going to help you automate your podcast workflow, is going to help you grow your audience, grow your email list, then the Simple Podcast Press Player is the podcast player for you. And if you use the coupon code SUCCESS at checkout, you're going to get a 25% discount. So it's a very sweet deal. And thank you, Hani, for making that available. Now, I want to ask you one thing, still talking about the player, about the email feature, the email list feature, because you said with the player, it is possible to add an opt-in form right below the podcast player, right?
Yeah, that's very important. It's compatible with it's not tied to any service provider. It works with the Aweber, MailChimp, Infusionsoft, whatever you're using. We have a very generic interface, so it works with pretty much all of them. The idea here is you want to get people on your email list, of course, because that's you can have a more deeper conversation. More, you don't want them to come and listen and leave. They may not come back. So it's a good way is to give them a bribe. I don't want to say the word bribe, but give them a gift that's worth them leaving their email address. So, and the beauty is you have to make this thing once, and then it's there on every single episode on your site.
Yeah, that's actually what you just said, Henny. Thank you for saying that, because I think that some people may have thought, well, that sounds cool and everything, but do I have to create an opt-in form, a new opt-in form for every single episode I publish? But as you just said, if we have a specific resource we want to make available to our listeners, then we can easily do that. And by the way, something I want to emphasize is that all the features we've talked about, like the clickable timestamps, the buttons that can be added below the player, and so forth, are things that people can use and leverage without having to know coding or anything like that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's really, it can be fully automated in a sense that it pulls the episode, adds the player. You don't even need to log into your WordPress site, but it is also customizable in a sense that if you want to add a player in a specific, while you're making your show notes, you want the player to be on a certain, halfway through the page, and you want to custom make a unique episode link, a unique link for a button per episode, you can do that. So it's very flexible. What I'm trying to say is if you want it, it can be completely hands-free. Once you set it up once, you don't even need to log into your site. You can have content published there automatically. Or you can, make your show notes page on your site and add the player. You can change the color. You can change the title and you can really customize it without using any code. Just kind of just as you're typing your show notes page, there's some options for the button there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. It's not a technical plugin. It's called simple.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know that is a keyword of yours, Henny, and what you create. And one feature that I also think can be very handy is the transcript feature. Now, it depends, obviously, from whether you use transcripts or not. But if you do, with the Simple Podcast Press Player, there's actually a feature where you can have your transcript displayed below the player in a way that isn't intrusive. So you can have a sentence or two, and then if a person clicks on it, then they see the entire transcript, so that your show notes page is gonna look great. And it goes without saying that this player, you can use it to add the specific episode track as well as your entire podcast archive. And Henny, I know that you have done something recently over the last few months with the Simple Podcast Press Player, which is great because some people may be here with you and I and they're like, oh, this feature sounds interesting. I know I would like to do this thing or that thing, but I already have a podcast player. Mm-hmm. Well, I know, Henny, that you now have worked some magic, and now the Simple Podcast Press is compatible with a couple of different podcast players as well, right?
Yes. So if you are currently using the PowerPress player, like the default PowerPress plugin, so if you're doing everything publishing from your site directly, there's literally an option that will just automatically update all your existing episodes with the player. So it just replaces the old player with a new player with like one click, which is really nice. We also have, we integrate with the Smart Podcast Player as well. So you can use the automation, the buttons in conjunction with the Smart Podcast Player if you already have that as well. Add the clickable timestamps to that player. So, it's got its own player, but a lot of these features that help you and help your listeners can also be integrated with the PowerPress and the Smart Podcast Player.
Which I think was a great move on your part, Henny. And it is very useful because, as we are saying, some people may be using podcast players already, and if they want to use what they use but enhance their overall experience and opportunities they provide their listeners with, then they can do that by integrating or start using the Simple Podcast Press alongside another podcast player, which is, for example, what I do, that I have for certain features the Smart Podcast Player, but then many of the Simple Podcast Press Player features that I wanted to make sure I have and are there on my site, I can use them because the two plugins work together. And Henny, you shared with us some advice on what matters, let's say, about podcasting when it comes to the workflow and being more efficient. You talked about a few things we can do to repurpose content and really get more exposure for our podcast. Now we talked about different things related to a podcast player. And I said early on that you have a new project coming out called Repurpose, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well. The site is repurpose.io. So now, Henny, can you take a moment to tell everybody what's cooking in the Repurpose pad?
Yeah, at the time of recording, basically, it's out right now. It's in beta. We have some early founders using it right now, and honestly, like, people are loving it. And as the name suggests, it is a repurposing tool for content creators. So what does that mean? It's going to automatically convert and distribute your content across different platforms. So for podcasters, you can set it up so you plug in your podcast feed, and then every single episode is converted to a video and published to YouTube.
Wow.
Automatic. You just click a button and you go to bed, and it's in, our servers will crunch it, convert it to a nice looking video with a nice waveform. One of my favorite features is it makes the artwork for YouTube automatically. Mm-hmm. We have these templates, so it adds a title to the template. It takes your cover art from your podcast, and it builds this nice image and adds a beautiful waveform on top of it, and it publishes to YouTube. All with, once you connect it, you can just say go and go to bed, and then all the episodes will automatically publish to YouTube. That's just one example. We've integrated Facebook Live. So you can do a Facebook Live and have that audio sent to your Dropbox, that converted to an audio, sent to your Dropbox. So you can use it as a podcast episode down the road if you wanted to. What else do we have? It's basically, I look at it as the if this, then that, or IFTTT for content creators. Nice. So everything I've described here, you set the rules. You can decide what podcast, what Facebook Live from this group, my personal profile, what content, what the input is, what the action is. You want to convert it to a video or upload it as a video itself. For example, Facebook Live could go to YouTube automatically. And what the output is, like where you're sending it to. So you set the rules, the in, out, and the action. And every time you publish a new episode, whether it's a podcast, a Facebook Live, whatever it is, the content will get converted and distributed automatically for you. You don't need to upload anything. You don't need to log into anything. It just happens.
It's crazy. And I think you described it very well, Hani, when you said that if this, then that for content creators. And obviously that includes podcasters as well. And you mentioned, thank you for that, by the way, you mentioned a couple of things we can do by using Repurpose. So once again, the site is repurpose.io, and you'll find the link to that as well as everything else Hani and I have talked about in this episode in the show notes. And Hani, you mentioned a couple of things Repurpose allows us to do. You mentioned throughout this conversation a few things we can do to get more exposure for our podcast and so forth. And you being a person that works closely with podcasters, you create tools for podcasters as well as content creators in more general terms. I wanted to ask you if there is anything else that maybe we haven't covered that you think would be worth mentioning when it comes to creating audio content, getting more exposure, helping potential listeners become listeners, and not only that, but become long-term listeners. Anything comes to mind?
Nothing new, but basically it's the idea of focusing on the content first, not the editing and not the extra work around it, focusing on delivering good content and talking to your audience. And what I mean by that is, kind of asking them through surveys, if they're on their email list, ask them what kind of content do they want to hear. So keep adapting your content, not what you want to talk about, but what they want to listen to.
Amen to that. I love that quote, Hani, because you're right. I think that oftentimes we are a bit guilty of that. We're sure it is our show, but the show shouldn't be about us and what we want to talk about, but it should be about the intersection between what we would like to talk about and something that our audience is interested in or is struggling with or is passionate about. So you said it is about creating something our audience wants, and the tools you have created definitely help us with us. Hani, I know your site is hanimourra.com. You're on pretty much any social media platform. If somebody would like to connect with you or has questions or anything like that, what would you say is the fastest way to do that?
I think Facebook probably. To be honest, Facebook is. I don't hang out on Twitter that much. I'm on it. Facebook would be the best. So if you go to hanimourra.com, there'll be a link to my Facebook.
Perfect.
I'd be happy to hear from you. Answer questions. I'm part of the groups and a lot of the podcasting groups. Part of your group as well.
Sounds good. So is it okay, Hani, if I will also add the link of the Facebook page in the show notes, even though it's available on your site already?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's Facebook. I think it's facebook.com/Hani Mourra.
Okay, sounds good. I'll double check and add the link to that. And Hani, this has been a fun interview. And to wrap it up, do you have any final piece of advice? Again, something related to what we've covered, or an interesting example or strategy you may have seen a podcaster do when it comes to what we've been discussing here, or anything at all?
Create good content and experiment with putting it out to different platforms, and don't get discouraged because it does take time to build an audience. So keep at it. Even don't worry about numbers too much. Just as long as you're reaching out to somebody or a group of people and you're getting feedback, you're on the right track.
I love it. Yeah. And thank you really for stressing the importance of the fact that building an audience or a community is a long-term thing. And it's something that is really built person after person, listener after listener. So it's not that, we wake up and suddenly we have like hundreds or thousands of people listening to us. So especially if you're just starting out, or maybe you feel you're in a slump, your show isn't growing, really take Hani's words to heart. And if you aren't already, make sure to check out the show notes page and check out some of the tools he has created, because I'm sure they're going to help you big time. Hani, thank you so much for being here, for what you do for the podcasting community, and for sharing your story, tools, and expertise with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Jan. Thanks for having me.
And we are back. So what did you think about Hani's tips? Pretty good, huh? Remember, it all starts with the content. It's not about what you want, it's about what your audience wants. And you heard, Hani has been working on a new tool called Repurpose. We talked about that. We also talked about Hani's podcast player, the Simple Podcast Press Player. And I mentioned a coupon code you can use to get a 25% discount. So if that is a player that sounds interesting, again, we said it, you can use it in combination with another player like I do. Everything we talked about, Repurpose, the player, the coupon code, Hani's site, everything can be found over at janilunga.com/episode 203. Next week, we're gonna change gear, we're gonna change topic, and we're gonna focus on something you can do to live a healthier life, and how you can do all that in just 4 minutes a day.
Thank you for listening to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast. For more tips and tools, head over to www.janilunga.com.